I've spent 63 years building things. A roofing business I started with one truck and a borrowed ladder. A house in Billings, Montana that I paid off in 14 years because I made a rule early on that debt is the one thing you don't let follow you to bed at night. A son named Marcus, 34 years old, the kind of man who fixes things before you have to ask, who calls on Tuesdays not because he has to, but because he wants to. You know what I never built? A welcome mat for people who believe that what a man spends his life assembling is just a waiting room for their own ambitions. But we'll get to Raymond. First, let me tell you about the Saturday morning I drove out to my lake property in Flathead County and realized my son's brother-in-law had been living there for the better part of 3 weeks. Welcome, folks. I'm glad you're here. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. What I'm about to share with you took 2 years to fully play out, and every single piece of it was worth it. Now let's get into it. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old, born and raised in Billings, Montana, third generation. My father laid asphalt. His father before him did land clearing. I went into roofing because I liked the idea of putting something over people's heads, something solid, something that held. Callahan Roofing ran for 28 years before I sold it. I won't tell you what I sold it for, but I will tell you that when the check cleared, I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot for a solid 4 minutes, just listening to the engine tick. My son Marcus married a woman named Diane 3 years ago. Good woman, sharp, works in hospital administration, doesn't miss much. Her family is from Spokane. Her mother Patricia is the kind of woman who sends thank you notes and means them. Her father Gerald is quiet, measured, stays in his lane. I have no complaints about any of them, and I want to be clear about that, because this story is not about Diane's parents. This story is about Diane's younger brother, Raymond Kowalski, 31 years old, never held a job longer than 8 months that I was aware of. The kind of man who describes himself as being between opportunities the same way other men describe themselves as employed, friendly in the way that people are friendly when they need something. All warmth, all the time, until the warmth stopped being useful. I have a second property, a cabin on Flathead Lake, 12 miles outside of Kalispell. I bought it 9 years ago when the market gave me a window and I was smart enough to climb through it. 3 bedrooms, screened porch, a dock that needs repainting every other summer, and a view of the water at dawn that I am not capable of describing accurately because some things resist language. I used it summers, occasionally in the fall during hunting season, and I'd been considering for the past year whether to bring it into a short-term rental rotation. Flathead County gets serious tourist traffic from May through September, and the numbers made sense. That September, I drove up on a Saturday morning to do a walkthrough. Checklist in my jacket pocket. I wanted to assess the dock, check the water heater, it had been running louder than usual on my last visit, photograph anything that needed attention before I brought a property manager in. It was a clear Montana morning, the kind that makes you feel like the world was designed specifically to be driven through with the windows down and nothing urgent on your mind. I was in a good mood. I had coffee in a travel mug. I had Merle Haggard on the radio and 2 hours of clean highway in front of me. I turned off the county road onto my gravel drive at 9:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I looked at the clock on the dash when I saw the vehicles. A black Ford F-150 with Idaho plates parked up against the left side of the cabin. A tan Subaru Outback I didn't recognize pulled halfway into the grass beside the dock path. And my kayak that I keep padlocked to the rack on the south side of the property was sitting loose on the dock, wet, like someone had used it that morning and dragged it back without bothering to secure it. I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, the way you sit when your brain is doing that slow, methodical turn, checking each piece of information against what it should be, looking for the place where the math stops adding up. The F-150 with Idaho plates. I'd seen that truck once before, parked outside Marcus and Diane's house in Billings at Christmas 2 years ago, Raymond's truck. I got out. I walked to my front door. It was unlocked. I want you to stay with me here, because I need you to feel the full weight of what I walked into. My living room. Raymond Kowalski stretched across my couch with his boots still on, left foot hanging off the armrest, right hand resting on his chest like a man who sleeps in a place he considers his own. A woman I had never seen in my life sitting cross-legged on my kitchen counter eating cereal, from my cabinet out of my favorite bowl, The blue pottery one, my late wife Carol picked out at a craft fair in Missoula the summer before she got sick. Two duffel bags against the wall beside the hallway. Toiletries lined up on my kitchen windowsill. A phone charger plugged into my outlet. A pair of boots by the door that were not mine. And on my kitchen table, mail, not my mail. A credit card offer addressed to Raymond Kowalski. A piece of correspondence from an Idaho bank. And a pizza delivery receipt dated 11 days ago with my address on it. My address? On a receipt for food he ordered to my house 11 days before I showed up to find him on my couch. Raymond woke up when I let the screen door close behind me. He looked at me, blinked once, and then did the thing that told me everything I would ever need to know about Raymond Kowalski. He smiled. Not the smile of a man caught doing something he shouldn't. The smile of a man pleasantly surprised by a visit. Like I was the one who'd shown up unexpectedly, in his space, interrupting his morning. "Hey, Bobby," he said. "No one calls me Bobby. I've never introduced myself as Bobby in my life." Raymond had started calling me that at Christmas dinner 2 years ago, and I had let it go because it was Christmas, and Carol had been gone for only 14 months, and I didn't have the energy for small corrections. I regretted that now. I didn't move from the doorway. I didn't respond to Bobby. I looked at the woman on the counter, who had stopped eating and was watching me with the careful stillness of someone deciding whether to speak. I looked at the duffel bags. I looked at the mail on my table. Then I looked back at Raymond. "What is going on here?" I said, not loud, not shaking. The same voice I used for 28 years when a job site needed to be corrected, and I needed every man on that crew to understand that the correction was not optional. Raymond swung his legs off the couch and sat up with the easy, unhurried movement of a man in absolutely no discomfort. He ran a hand through his hair. "Oh," he said, "I meant to call you about that. Marcus said you weren't using the place till November. We just needed somewhere to land for a few weeks while the Boise thing works itself out. Diane said it was fine." I stood with that for 3 full seconds. Diane said it was fine. He reached for his phone on the cushion beside him and looked at it briefly, the way people look at phones when they want to seem like they have somewhere important to be. The woman on the counter, he hadn't introduced her, didn't appear to plan to slid down quietly and took her cereal bowl to the sink. "Raymond," I said. My voice was quieter this time, which is something I learned over 6 decades means you're more serious, not less. "This is my property. My deed. My name on every piece of paperwork in every county record going back 9 years. I'm going to need you to tell me how long you've been here, and I'm going to need everything that belongs to you gone by the time I come back this afternoon." He opened his mouth. I held up one hand. "That's all," I said. I walked back to my truck. I backed out of the driveway at a normal speed. I drove exactly 2 miles down the county road to a pullout above the lake, where I've stopped 100 times over the years to look at the water when I needed to think clearly. I sat there with the engine off. The lake was doing that thing it does in September, flat and silver, and so still you can see the mountains doubled in it, like the world has a reflection it's been keeping to itself. Then I called my son. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Call the sheriff's department. Criminal trespass. Walk back in there and make it official, immediate, and permanent. And I want to be straight with you about something, because I think you deserve the honest version. That is not the wrong instinct. That is, in fact, a completely sound and legally valid response to what I walked into. The reason I didn't go that route immediately is not because I was uncertain. It's because I had already, in the 90 seconds between Raymond's couch and my truck, started thinking about something larger than that afternoon. And the larger thing required a different sequence. "I'll explain," Marcus answered on the first ring. "Dad, what's up? I need you to answer a question before anything else," I said. "Did you tell Raymond he could use the Flathead cabin?" Silence. "The specific kind that stretches a half-second too long." "No," he said. "I said you probably weren't up there much before November. I didn't tell him he could stay there. I didn't even know he was looking for somewhere to go." "Does Diane know?" Another pause. Shorter this time. Harder. "I'll find out right now." I told him what I'd walked into. The trucks, the stranger in my kitchen, the mail on my table, the kayak wet on the dock. I told him calmly and in the correct order, and I did not editorialize. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is a quality in a person that I have always respected and apparently succeeded in passing along. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And I could tell from the particular weight of it that he meant the real kind of sorry, not the kind that's asking for forgiveness, but the kind that comes from a good man who's just understood that someone he loves did something that reflected poorly on everyone in his name. "Don't be," I said. "This didn't come from you. What I need from you right now is to stay out of it while I handle the first part. I will call you when I'm ready for the next part. Can you do that?" He said yes. I knew he would. I called my attorney next, Phil Greer, 21 years, Bozeman, Montana, which is close enough to Flathead County to know exactly how property law sits in this part of the state. Phil picks up for me on Saturdays because I once drove 40 minutes in a February ice storm to sign paperwork he needed by end of business, and he has never forgotten it. I told him everything in sequence, same as I told Marcus. Phil listened the same way a good attorney listens quietly, without reacting, collecting every detail into the careful, organized structure of a mind that's going to need to use them. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. "Andrew," he said, "Phil has called me Andrew my entire life despite my name being Robert, and I stopped correcting him in 2009. How long do you think he's been there?" "That receipt was 11 days old," I said, "and the mail wasn't from yesterday." Phil said the word that lawyers say when something has moved from inconvenient into meaningful. I won't repeat it, but it was one syllable, and he said it low. "Here's what we do," he said. What Phil built over the following week was methodical and quiet, and like all good legal work, completely invisible until it wasn't. First, a formal report filed with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. Not a dramatic call, not an eviction, just a trespassing report, dated, time-stamped. In the permanent record, Raymond and his companion left the property that same Saturday afternoon, I know, because I drove back at 4 o'clock and the F-150 was gone, the Subaru was gone, and my kayak had been dragged back to the rack, though it hadn't been padlocked, which I thought was a fittingly half-committed ending to a fittingly half-committed occupation. Second, a certified letter sent directly to Raymond Kowalski at his last known address in Boise, Idaho, formally notifying him that his presence at my Flathead County property had been unauthorized, that he had used said property without permission of the owner, and that any future entry without written and signed authorization from me would be pursued as criminal trespass under Montana law. I did not warn anyone the letter was coming, not Diane, not Marcus, not Patricia and Gerald, who I suspected knew nothing about any of it and deserved to be left out of something their son had manufactured entirely on his own. Third, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to, because this is where the afternoon stopped being about Raymond and started being about something that would outlast Raymond entirely. I called Phil back 4 days later and told him I wanted to talk about the Flathead property in a larger context. Not just the trespass, the property itself, what it was worth, and what I wanted to happen to it. Phil said, "Tell me what you're thinking." So I told him, "Here's what nobody explains to you about the moment after someone helps themselves to something you built. The anger is real, but it passes faster than you expect. What doesn't pass is the clarity. That cold, specific, unsentimental understanding of exactly who has been standing in your living room, in your kitchen, on your dock, counting things that don't belong to them. That clarity is actually useful, if you know how to use it." I listed the Flathead property with a local manager named Susan Hartwell, who had been handling vacation rentals in Flathead County for 16 years, and described her approach to property management the way a surgeon describes an approach to a procedure, precisely, without drama, with a specific expectation of the outcome. She had the listing up within a week. By the end of the first month, I had consistent bookings through the following April. The property was generating income. Raymond Kowalski's free September was now funding my retirement, which struck me as an appropriate arrangement. But the property was only the first move. I called Phil again on a Thursday morning in October, 2 weeks after the listing went live, the kind of Montana October morning where the air has turned serious and the mountains have gone from suggestion to fact. I told him I'd been thinking about the larger structure, about Marcus, about what I was building and what I wanted it to do, and, more specifically, what I did not want it to do. Phil has heard a lot from me over 21 years. Business restructurings, the sale of Callahan Roofing, Carroll's estate, 3 property transactions. He has a voice he uses when he understands that what I'm asking for is more than paperwork, a slightly slower cadence, more space between words, the voice of a man making sure he gets every piece of it right. He used that voice now. "Tell me everything," he said. I told him. When I finished, he said, "Robert, that is the most comprehensive thing you've asked me to build in 2 decades. Can it be done?" "Yes." "Do you want me to start today?" "Yes," I said. He started that afternoon. What Phil built over the following 3 weeks was a trust, not a simple document. A carefully, specifically, deliberately structured trust that took Phil the better part of those 3 weeks to draft with the kind of precision that means it won't be undone by a clever reading or a sympathetic judge. I want to tell you what it said in plain language, because the plain language is where it matters. Marcus would inherit everything, completely, fully. His father had not punished him for what his brother-in-law did with a key that nobody authorized and an address that nobody gave. Marcus is the single best thing I put into this world, and the trust said so in the only language that courts actually respect: specific, unconditional, documented inheritance with his name on it. But the trust included a clause, written clearly, without ambiguity, reviewed by a second attorney, Phil brought in specifically to check his work, stating that if Marcus's spouse wished to have any legal claim on, access to, or benefit from any asset held in the trust, she would first be required to sign a postnuptial agreement. Independent counsel. Voluntary execution. Properly recorded. Not because I believed Diane was Raymond. Diane was not Raymond. But I had watched Diane look at my property and say it was fine for her brother to occupy it without asking me, and I had understood in that moment that love can coexist with a blind spot wide enough to drive a truck through. I was not going to leave a structure that took me 63 years to build exposed to a blind spot. That is not cruelty. That is what building something actually means. You don't just put it up, you protect it, or the putting up was theater. Phil also established a separate fund, specifically designated for any future grandchildren, children of Marcus, structured to pass directly to them in the event that circumstances ever required it, bypassing their parents entirely, going straight to the next generation. Education. Foundation. Start. I thought about that fund for a long time after Phil read it back to me. About people who don't exist yet sitting on a dock on Flathead Lake on a September morning looking at water that doubles the mountains. My wife Carol would have built that fund herself if she'd been here long enough to see the need for it. She always looked further ahead than me. Even at the end, she was looking further ahead. I told no one. Not Marcus, not Diane, not my friend Walt, who called twice that month and got the same easy Robert Callahan. He always gets warm, interested, unhurried. I went to dinner with Marcus and Diane 3 weeks after the trespass report was filed. I asked good questions. I laughed at the right moments. Diane mentioned at some point, carefully, that Raymond had landed somewhere in Portland, a new situation that sounded promising. I looked up from my plate with the mild expression of a man receiving mildly interesting news. "Portland," I said. "Good city." She watched my face for just a beat longer than the sentence required. I gave her nothing. I booked a week in Glacier National Park in late October. Stayed at a small lodge outside of Polbridge, the kind of place that has no cell service and a wood stove and a proprietor who slides breakfast under your door in a basket at 7 in the morning without being asked. I hiked. I read. I slept without an alarm clock for 7 straight days and woke up every morning to a world that had no awareness of Raymond Kowalski whatsoever. On the last morning, I wrote 2 postcards, one to Marcus and Diane at their Billings address. The same image on both the peaks above Bowman Lake, which in October looked like something from a world that preceded human decisions entirely. A short note on the back of each. Taking some time. Country is beautiful up here. Back soon. Robert. I want you to think about what Diane did when she held that postcard. The Flathead property had just gone into short-term rental rotation. The man who put it there had said nothing about it, explained nothing, argued nothing, and was now sending postcards from Glacier with the handwriting of someone on a pleasant vacation. No anger, no confrontation, no indication of what had been drafted and notarized and filed in the weeks before he left. just a man in the mountains, completely at peace. That postcard was its own communication. And Diane Kowalski Callahan, who was considerably sharper than her brother, and knew it, understood the moment she turned it over that the communication was not nothing. She just didn't know yet how deep it went. I came back from Glacier on a Sunday. Monday morning I called Marcus. "How was the trip?" he said. "Clarifying," I said. "Listen, I need to have a family meeting at my place. Saturday afternoon. You and Diane both, if she's available." He was quiet for a moment. "Is everything okay, Dad?" "Everything is fine," I said. "Better than fine. There are things I want everyone to hear directly, at the same time, from the same source. No confusion afterward. Phil Greer will be there." The silence on the line had a particular quality. The silence of a man who is his father's son and has just run the variables and arrived at a shape he can't quite name yet. "We'll be there," he said. Saturday came the way important Saturdays always do, indistinguishable from the outside until you're inside it. Phil arrived at noon, 90 minutes early, set his briefcase on my dining room table, accepted coffee, and reviewed his documents with the quiet focus of a man who built something he believes in and wants to present it right. "How do you want to handle this?" he said. "Plainly," I said. "Read everything as written, no commentary, no editorializing. Let the documents be what they are." "And you," he said. "I'll sit at the end of the table," I said, "and let the paperwork do the talking." Phil looked at me over his glasses for a moment. "You've been sitting on that line for a while." "3 weeks," I said. He almost smiled. Marcus and Diane arrived at 1:15, Marcus in a flannel, Diane in a dark green sweater, her hair back, carrying the careful, composed energy of a woman who has been thinking hard about a conversation she doesn't have enough information to fully anticipate. Her eyes went to Phil's briefcase, then to Phil, then to me. I smiled, genuine and warm. "Come in. Sit down." We settled at the table, Phil at one end with his documents, me at the other, Marcus and Diane across from each other in the middle, Marcus with his hands flat on the table, Diane with hers folded in her lap, very still. "Thank you both for making the time," I said. "I asked Phil here because I've made decisions about my estate, and I want everyone to hear them directly, clearly, and at the same time. No confusion. No second-hand information. No surprises down the road." I looked at both of them. "Phil, go ahead." What happened over the next 35 minutes was not a confrontation. There was no raised voice, no pointed finger, no moment where a chair scraped back dramatically against the floor. It was something quieter than all of that. A man reading legal documents at a dining room table in Billings, Montana. A good man, doing his job the way good men do their jobs methodically, without rush, in language precise enough to mean exactly one thing. Phil started with the rental arrangement for the Flathead property. Formal, revenue generating, operational since October. He slid the management agreement to the center of the table. Marcus looked at it. Diane looked at it. Neither spoke. Then the trust. Phil walked through Daniel's inheritance, Marcus's inheritance completely. Every asset, the full scope of it. Clearly, generously, without a single dollar diminished. I watched Diane's shoulders release a fraction, a barely visible thing, the physical release of a weight she hadn't been able to name since the postcard arrived. Then Phil turned the page and read the clause. The silence that followed was the most complete silence my house has ever held. I watched Diane's face move through 3 things in the space of 4 or 5 seconds. First, the shock not performed, not managed, the genuine involuntary kind that arrives before a person has time to arrange themselves. Second, something shifting behind her eyes, a slow understanding that what her brother had done in September, that afternoon in my cabin, had not simply been witnessed and let go, had not simply been noted and forgotten, but had been translated into something sitting on this table right now that she had not known existed until this moment. And third, and this is the thing that told me everything I needed to know about who Diane actually is underneath the situation she'd been put in, something that looked like relief. The complicated, raw, difficult relief of someone who has been carrying a weight they couldn't name and has just had it named for them by someone else. She looked at me. I held her gaze. No score being settled. No satisfaction on display. Just clear, direct, steady. "I see you. I saw this. I did what I had to do." She looked back at the table. Marcus had read the clause twice. I could tell by the way his eyes went back to the beginning. When he looked up at me, his face had moved through its own quiet rearrangement, not toward anger, not toward defense, but toward something I recognized because I had felt it myself at 29 years old, standing in a job trailer in Billings, understanding for the first time that the work was serious and you had better build it like it was. Understanding that the clause was not punishment, not an accusation of Diane. It was a wall built around his future by a man who had watched someone assume that future was already available and had decided, without drama, without malice, that it would never be that easy. My son understood. His father had protected him. Phil moved to the final document. The grandchildren's fund. He explained it plainly. Separate. Fully funded. Designated exclusively for future grandchildren of Robert Callahan. Structured to pass directly to them if circumstances ever required it, bypassing the middle generation entirely, going straight to the children. Education. Start. Foundation. Already waiting for people who don't exist yet. Diane made a sound. Small. Involuntary. Not a word, just the sound that escapes when something reaches a place you forgot you were leaving unguarded. She pressed her lips together, and Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. No hesitation. No glance at me for permission. Just his hand over hers, steady and immediate. I looked at my son in that moment and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since September. Phil gathered his documents, closed his briefcase with a soft, clean click, looked at me. I nodded. I pushed back my chair, stood up, buttoned my jacket, unhurried. The way you button a jacket when something is finished and you know what comes next. I looked at each of them. At Phil, who had built this with me and executed it without a single misstep. At Marcus, who has his mother's steadiness and my stubbornness and more strength in him than he has ever needed to fully use. At Diane, who was looking at me with an expression I would need more than one word to describe, honest and complicated and more open than anything I had seen from her in a long time. I spoke slowly. Not carefully true things don't need to be chosen carefully. They just need room to travel at the right speed. I built everything in this family, I said. Every asset, every dollar, every structure Phil just walked you through. I built it with my hands and my time and years of my life that I gave willingly, because that is what you do for the people you love. I paused, and I protected it the same way. Not to punish anyone, not to control anyone, but because building something and leaving it unprotected is not love. It is just carelessness, with a generous face. I looked at both of them. Now, who's hungry? I made chili. Phil stayed for 2 bowls. Marcus squeezed my shoulder at the door, that same solid grip, the one that says more than a paragraph of conversation. Diane paused on the porch, turned back, looked at me for a moment with that same open, complicated expression. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you, Robert," and walked to the car. She called me Robert. First time in 3 years. My friend Walt called that evening. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," I said. "Fine? That's it?" "It went exactly the way it was supposed to," I said. "Phil was excellent. Marcus understood everything. And Diane?" I walked to my kitchen window, looked out at the Billings evening, the rimrocks going dark in the distance, permanent and completely unimpressed by anything the Kowalski family had assumed about the future. "She said thank you on the way out," I said. "The real kind." Walt was quiet for a second. "And Raymond?" "Raymond," I said. "We'll hear all of it through Diane. The cabin, the trust, the clause, the grandchildren's fund. He'll sit in Portland and understand what the whole picture means." I set down my coffee. "And then he'll think about a man who filed a report, restructured an estate, rented out a lake cabin, flew to the mountains, sent postcards, and came home and called a family meeting. All of it without raising his voice once, without making a single threat, without losing his composure for a single moment. What does he conclude from all that?" Walt said. I looked out at the rimrocks. "That the Saturday morning he stretched out on my couch with his boots on," I said, "was the most expensive nap he ever took. The postnuptial agreement was signed 11 weeks after the family meeting. Independent counsel, voluntary, on record. Diane signed it herself, and she told Marcus afterward that she had wanted to sign it. I believe her. The Flathead cabin is booked solid through next summer. A family from Arizona rented it for 2 weeks last month and left a note on the kitchen counter saying the dock at dawn was the most peaceful thing they'd ever sat on. I read that and thought, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Raymond Kowalski has not contacted me since September. Somewhere in Portland, a man who once helped himself to another man's kayak and cereal and address and assumed it was available to him, sits with whatever version of the future he's currently assembling and understands if he's capable of understanding that there is a lake cabin in Flathead County that he will never set foot in again, a trust he will never see the inside of, and a grandchildren's fund built for people who don't exist yet whose future he cannot touch. He knows what happened. He just has to keep knowing it, every day, going forward. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from. I read them. I'll see you on the next one.